Hi, this is Jack O'Keefe, and I'm here today speaking with a friend and a colleague, Miranda McPherson. Hi, Miranda.
Hi, Jack. It's great to be here together with you today, and how wonderful that we get to open up a conversation that's very dear to both of our hearts about how we can really keep it clean as spiritual teachers and two sort of feminine teachers in a contemporary context. Both of us have been so strongly influenced by Sri Ramana Maharshi and the grace of Arunachala and amongst other important influences. But how we can walk a true path that, avoids some of the common pitfalls of walking a path without a conventional religion and all of the structures that come with that religion that can help offset some of the difficulties and the traps of spiritual life in a contemporary society.
Indeed. And it's a wide topic to explore what it's like for each of us. The one thing that I think has ignited this conversation that we're going to have now is that the contemporary culture requires us to walk our talk. As spiritual teachers, we owe it to ourselves individually and to anybody who enjoys what we do in our work.
Yeah. And I think, that term walking our talk, everybody understands it, but what does it really mean when it comes to being a spiritual teacher and, accepting the fact that whatever role we have in our life, we're all still human and we're all still in a process of continued unfolding and awakening, and we're living in a culture where there's so much more pressure and it's more complex than perhaps it would be if we were living in the East in an ashram or up a mountain. And so some of the difficulties that we can run into and the confusions that can get played out are immense. And I know you and I care very deeply about really embodying our deepest intentions in the practical application in every moment of our life, whether we're with students or not. And I know that both you and I have had to sort of work with a lot of people who've experienced very devastating experiences with other teachers that have been very damaging to them. I know you care very much about exploring what we can do as a community to help prevent some of those challenges, help educate people. I'm so respectful of the work that you and Craig and Rick are doing in trying to sort of bring forth a deeper conversation amongst the broader non-dual community about the importance of integrity and what that actually means. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, and it goes wider than the non-dual. I think it's spiritual leadership in every tradition and non-tradition where it's going contemporary-wise. And the organization, the effort that Miranda is speaking to is the Association for Spiritual Integrity. The way I look at it, I think, is we can stand on a high pedestal and say, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. But I think shame on us if we take that position. That's my personal viewpoint, because I see it as an opportunity to change the culture, to change the understanding of what it is to operate from truth or a wider perspective of consciousness. Mm-hmm. I think the traditions that have been held so beautifully in the East and have fallen into the West from the 50s, 60s, 70s are being met with our culture here of more psychological well-being and taking ownership over our shadow side, about repressed trauma and what does that do to the psyche.
Yeah.
And one thing that jumps out at me is things that I believed from scriptures, from reading about saints and sages. Some of photographs are up here behind me. Reading that material and believing naively that once you are awake, it takes care of everything. That all of a sudden that the decks will be clear. That
I think that's
somehow
right. I mean, that's not my experience. You know, I've been reading spiritual biography and scripture since I was a teenager, and you know, I've really loved the inspiration and the transmission that one gets from reading scripture and spiritual biography. And yet, you know, how hard it is to actually let go of some of our deeply entrenched patterns, even after significant realization. And so for my money, I think the virtue of humility is extremely important. You know, no matter where we are on the path, you know, the humility to recognize and respect the power of the unconscious, and that while we might have allowed a deep dissolving to happen in a moment on the meditation cushion or even spontaneously, that doesn't mean that such an experience of non-duality or unity is completely integrated throughout all the dimensions of our being. And in my experience, that's been a lot more work. You know, the digesting of, you know, a deep spiritual experience. And what I've found is that often it dislodges hidden parts of our psyche that we didn't know existed, and that needs to be compassionately addressed, you know, and usually with the help of somebody else who can hold space for us and who can help us to really be thorough and honest with these hidden motivations that are there.
Yes.
You know, I know I've said to you before in another conversation that one of the things that I've seen often is how deep the desire in most ego structures is to be special, to be somebody notable or, you know, worthwhile. And of course, you know, becoming a spiritual teacher looks very glamorous and exciting to the ego. You know, you get a lot of people who think highly of you and idealize you and think very positively about you, and the ego can really feed off that very easily. And so, you know, it can also become this kind of shell, this costume that we slip into, you know, and then it becomes very tricky.
Yes.
Where we start to think that we're above, you know, losing our temper or, you know, having preferences, preferring one student over another, or, you know, just subtly misusing the devotion that might be coming towards us from people who are very grateful for what they might have experienced in our satsang chair in a way that is not quite right.
Yeah, I think too, you know, an indicator might be if, as a spiritual leader, you get off on the tiniest little bit of devotion, or somebody just pulling back their opinion and bowing to yours when you know they haven't really understood it. If there is some place that you're getting off on the preferential treatment, I smell a rat, I smell a shadow. And that's an indicator, okay, if you're getting off on it at all, if you believe, well, I know more because I've had this deep awakening, it's like trouble, trouble, trouble.
Yeah, well, who is it that's claiming the awakening as mine? You know, there's a red flag right there.
Yeah.
Because true awakening dissolves the specialness of me and my. And so I think the red flag is thinking, oh, now I'm special because I've had this significant experience. And that's a sign that some ego appropriation has happened.
And then
go on.
If we couple that then with, you know, oh, the teacher is always right, with the authority that is bestowed on the teacher, you know, and well, I'm awake. I mean, therefore there's no more work to do. So if you have those two ideas in your unconscious or in your conscious, there would be every reason not to develop the humility and to cultivate the introspection of taking responsibility for ourselves as human beings.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of this comes down to, you know, recognizing the relative and the absolute levels of our being, that, you know, our true nature is, you know, indestructible, innocent, free, pure, is love, is freedom, is that, and is nobody in particular. And yet that true nature manifests in all sorts of individual ways, you know, with unique qualities and gifts. You know, we don't all have the same gifts. And there's no kind of denying it, that some people have a very significant realization, but their capacity to transmit and teach and communicate and help others is not that developed. And so I think that's a sort of whole other part of it, because to really help others to wake up and deepen spiritually, you know, it requires a lot of different kinds of qualities and capacities. But in tandem with what you were just saying about, you know, looking at where our ego might get off on the praise and the adoration and the devotion, I think parallel is inevitably, I found in like almost 30 years of working with others on the path, that where there's a big idealization, at a certain point, that's going to flip. It's going to become a demonization. They're going to think badly of you. They're going to, and usually when they start seeing, hey, you're just a human being, you know. And of course, you know, that can be very challenging for some people that want to get the support by thinking that you're superhuman, you know.
Yes.
And inevitably, we're not superhuman. We're just beings, you know, no matter what our level of realization is. And so can a teacher just hold with awareness and compassion the moment when it flips, and understand what's happening for the student and recognize their need for support in it all, you know, and serve them. And for me, that's actually, you know, what it's really all about, is how does everything that I do and say and the way that I am, how does that actually serve the people that choose me as their teacher? Because that has to be the primary motivation, and that will inevitably, you know, demand that I keep growing, not only in my awareness and understanding, but in the integration of that awareness and that understanding, and in the skill set of actually teaching and transmitting. And that requires humility ongoingly. And it also requires the refusal of the model of someone being a done deal. To me, that's just ridiculous.
Yes, it's just ridiculous.
You know, as I look out the window to see Mother Nature doing what she does, Mother Nature doesn't stop evolving and unfolding. There's continual, you know, creation and sustenance, and then dissolving and transformation, and that is the nature of everything. Why would it not be the nature of us?
That's right. That's right. The evolutionary process has to continue to unfold, or we're stagnating it. And while the absolute is immune from that evolutionary process, being outside of time and space, it's showing up here through a vessel that is subject to evolution. And the laws that work there and the laws that work here in this phenomenon, sometimes it takes a bit of wisdom and maturity to learn how to hold both, because they can be different. And I know myself, it's like I've got to manage my human needs. You know, there are no needs in the wider perspective, of course. That viewpoint, the idea of having needs is bonkers.
Right.
But as a woman, of course I have needs. There's all kinds of needs, and I am responsible for making them happen. I have to own that as a woman, as a human being. Does that mean that that level of ownership in some way jars with the knowing that there is no identity at all that has any validity? It doesn't. It doesn't, but it's the human part that has to be there. And I think when a shadow part shows up, and we know that, whoa, I screwed up, or maybe that wasn't really their fault after all. Maybe it was me. The ownership of some issue, of some repression, of some shadow piece has to come in again. And I've seen a lot of misunderstanding around, yeah, but how can you process something because there's no ownership? And it's like, when there is, you know, when we screw up, we have to own something and apologize. There is a human ownership there that has nothing to do with the identity that gets absolved with the deep awakening.
Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But, you know, I think I like to use a term more about skillful and unskillful, you know, in that I can always be growing in my skillfulness, in the way I communicate, in the way that I respond, in the language that I use.
Yes.
What I say, how much I say, and in the nuances. And I actually find that a delicious process, because it means that, there's no right, wrong, but there is responsibility to do one's part, And I love something that Sri Aurobindo says about, that resistance is part and parcel of the spiritual life. And that the resistance can be quite deep-rooted and subtle. And so sincere effort in our practices is required. And if that effort is done, then the rest really comes by grace of the divine force. And I'm all about grace, but, grace requires our rightful effort, our gentle effort, our sincere interest to be curious and to learn and to grow. And so, of course, inevitably in my experience as a teacher, sometimes when a student gets upset and perceives something that I've done as something that wasn't very helpful, I have a responsibility to listen to them. Yeah. And a big part of what I'm teaching in terms of methodology is holistic inquiry. And so it's also my responsibility to help the student inquire more deeply and more honestly into their own experience and their experience of me, and to understand the nature of projection, which is a huge force of our mind. And also to understand forces like idealization, that we all want to idealize our teachers or demonize them at varying stages of development, and how that is part of the process, and that the teacher needs to understand that and learn how to be present and skillful and compassionate and helpful in those places that are inevitably very tricky because they're so vulnerable. And they're inevitably interacting with psychodynamic material from when we were very young that's often subconscious or unconscious to us, and that has, a lot of hurt and sometimes deep suffering in. And all of this comes out when we actually go deeper with the teacher, and it needs to come out. And so I think, so much of what I see in terms of, spiritual teachers out in the marketplace is very little understanding of such things. And one of the concerns that I have is how little supervision they set up for themselves. Yeah. Like for myself, I think it's really important. Experience has taught me that I absolutely need to go and sit with some other spiritual teachers on a regular basis and to run things by them about what, questions I might have had about moments in the satsang chair and how I responded, and, review some things. Maybe I could have done that differently, or here's what happened, what do you think? Or just really put myself in situations where I can actually get feedback from people that understand the complexity and can help me, be sure that I'm staying on track. Yeah. And where I don't place myself in a position of authority when there's no one who can give me feedback. Yes. I think that's the biggest problem in the guru model that we've seen, is that there's no one who can give the guru figure feedback. They're seen as being infallible. Yeah. And I don't know of many instances where that hasn't backfired in pretty difficult ways.
Yes, it has to backfire because the power differential is false to begin with. And so it has to fall apart. And I think I love the way you speak about taking responsibility, and the amount of teachers that I've met who don't have friends who are not students. Mm. Even that, it's like, can there just be regular mates that don't quite understand what you do for a living? And can we...
That's an acid test right there, isn't it?
Yes.
Of like, how comfortable are you when no one has a clue or doesn't even care, what you get up to at the SAND conference or in the satsang chair?
That's right.
You just happen to be, your husband's wife or something. You're just a person. They have no idea that you've written a book, and they wouldn't even be interested in your kind of book. Are you comfortable with that?
That's right.
Can you really just relax and be nobody in particular?
Yeah.
It's
absolutely essential. I think we're not healthy, or we're not willing to be comfortable in our own skin. We're hiding behind the shell. We're hiding behind that the cloak of being the teacher. It's the litmus test. It is really, if we can just have regular friends.